Good evening and welcome to tonight's Dazzle Unlimited. I'm Steve Steinberg, your series host, and I'm pleased you're here with us tonight, of course. Welcome to the show. Well, I've got a very special program in store for this evening, and it's on a topic that is, to say the least, highly controversial. I particularly take no viewpoint one way or the other about this, other than to ask my special guest questions and to delve into the topic and learn what his views are and see if some sense can be made of what he has to present. As you should be curious as well, too. What's the topic? Let me hold up his book on this topic, and you'll know. UFOs and Nukes. Very extensive book. Basically, the connection, as Robert Hastings, the author, and my special guest alleges, the connections between UFOs, unidentified flying objects, whatever they may be, I don't know, and nuclear power-related facilities, nuclear warhead-tipped intercontinental ballistic missiles, nuclear bomb atmospheric tests, and on and on and on. According to his research, there is a connection. Is there? Let's find out what my special guest, Robert Hastings, has to say about all of this, because if there's something, it opens up a whole range of other questions. So let's begin. What got you into this field of investigation, and what are your qualifications to do this kind of research?
In 1967, my father, who was career Air Force, was stationed at Malmstrom Air Force Base, Montana. It was at that time and is to this day a Minuteman nuclear missile base. The entire countryside is surrounded by these underground nuclear missile sites, which are in turn controlled by launch control facilities. In March of 1967, I witnessed at the base air traffic control tower 5 UFOs being tracked on radar. I was a junior in high school, but I also had a job as a custodian 3 nights a week in the air traffic control tower. Over the course of a number of months, I made the acquaintance of one of the FAA controllers. One night when I was in there cleaning up, he motioned me over to his scope and said, "We're tracking UFOs." And I saw 5 blips, what to my eye seemed to be stationary on the screen. I asked a couple of questions. He seemed to get increasingly reticent to answer the questions, and after just probably a minute or two said, "Come back later and clean up," which I did. And when I came back, I tried to ask him more about what was occurring, and he didn't want to talk about it at all. I mentioned all of this to my father. My father worked in a huge windowless building called the Sage Building, and this was in the 1960s, state-of-the-art military radar, computer-assisted radar that covered North American airspace, and it was designed, of course, to prevent incursions by Soviet aircraft and so on. Mm-hmm. When I mentioned this story to my father, unbeknownst to me, he made inquiries at work, and long story short, after about 2 weeks, he just briefly said there are rumors around the workplace that these objects were UFOs, and they were hovering near and maneuvering around nuclear missile silos at a place called Judith Basin, which was southeast of the base by about 25 miles. This was very intriguing to me, but I didn't really pick up on this until 1973. At that point, a researcher named Raymond Fowler, who worked for Sylvania Corporation, one of the Minuteman system contractors, wrote a book in which he said Sylvania was getting reports from its Air Force contacts of UFO activity at Malmstrom Air Force Base, And what he said cryptically in his book was there were electronic malfunctions related to these sightings. And I didn't really know what that meant, but I was intrigued enough to begin seeking out persons who had been in the Air Force. I would not approach active duty personnel, but retired or former Air Force personnel who worked with missiles or radar, and just ask them, do you know anything about this? As you might imagine, it's such a controversial subject. Some of the people I approached just sort of laughed at me to my face. Some said, yeah, I know about that, but I can't really talk about it. And a small percentage said, yes, and I was there and this is what happened. So I began taking notes and interviewing these people. And this again began in 1973. In the last 35 years, I have now interviewed over 100, about 110 or 115 former nuclear missile launch officers, missile targeting officers, missile maintenance personnel, and missile guards who were not only at Malmstrom, but other missile bases around the United States. And this past July of 2008, I was on Larry King Live with 3 of these gentlemen. 2 were involved in the incident at Malmstrom that I'm discussing. Mm-hmm. And what they have said, one of the launch officers, Robert Salas, who was a lieutenant at the time, said that he was down in the underground launch capsule. He got a report from his security guard at ground level that there was a saucer-shaped object hovering above the gate of the security fence that surround the launch control facility. And he thought this guard was joking. Salas said on Larry King, I was about to, lash out at this kid because I thought it was a bad joke, over this secure telephone line. And he said seconds later, I looked on my missile readiness display panel, and one after the other, our missiles began to malfunction.
But they weren't being launched.
They were shutting down. They were dropping off. What the Air Force calls it dropping off alert status, and what that means is a malfunction of one kind or another. It was subsequently learned that the guidance and control systems of the missiles, 8 or 10 of these missiles, had simultaneously, in a matter of seconds, malfunction. The hardware had to be replaced. So suddenly he's no longer concerned with chastising this guard. He's now concerned with a strategic, weapons readiness issue, and he wakes his commander, and they're trying to figure out what's going on and so on. Lieutenant Salas said that he and his missile commander, were flown back to the base by helicopter when their shift was over. They were debriefed by what are called OSI agents, Office of Special Investigations.
Which is under the Air Force?
It's the Air Force's, it's counterintelligence. They do criminal investigations, but I have learned through my research that if someone who's involved in one of these nuclear weapons cases from the 60s to the 1990s, all of my sources continue to tell me the person who debriefed them was an OSI agent. And in any case, they were basically debriefed. They were told to tell their story, and then they were required to sign what are called national security non-disclosure statements, which, if you look at the print, says if you sign this and you talk about this case, you can go to jail for an extended period. So it's a very serious situation. And Mr. Salas left the Air Force. He did not retire. He left after some number of years.
Voluntarily, or?
Yeah, he just decided to do other things with his life. And he kept this secret until 1995. And at that point, he went public and started talking about this. Prior to that, however, beginning in 1981, I had gone on the college lecture circuit, and I've spoken now at over 500 colleges and universities, including Stanford. And what I've done is present declassified documents that have been released through the Freedom of Information Act, coupled with the testimony of my 100+ sources now, which every year increase and by numbers, and to try to let the American public know that this is real, this has been going on. The declassified documents from the FBI, for example, indicate that UFOs have been repeatedly sighted at Los Alamos as early as December of 1948.
Los Alamos is...
I was just going to say, Los Alamos, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the name, it was the laboratory that created atomic weapons during World War II. It's where Dr. Oppenheimer created the Manhattan Project, and we tested the first atomic bomb in the New Mexico desert, and then the next 2 bombs were dropped on Japan, which ended World War II at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And according to the declassified documents, within less than 4 years later, UFOs were repeatedly sighted. The documents called them flying discs, flying saucers, and balls of fire. And these were based on reports by personnel working at the lab, security personnel, and civilians in the area. Other documents indicate that Sandia Labs in my hometown of Albuquerque, it was where the weapons were assembled. Once they had been designed at Los Alamos, they in effect were engineered at Sandia Labs. UFOs suddenly began to be sighted around Sandia Labs. Now other declassified documents talk about UFOs at the Hanford site in Washington State, where we were creating plutonium for nuclear bombs. And we now have many cases in declassified documents and the testimony of former and retired military personnel of objects hovering right over the Hanford plant. At Oak Ridge in Tennessee, where we were processing uranium for weapons-grade uranium and plutonium, sightings, lots of sightings in the late 40s and early 50s around Oak Ridge. So this UFO nuclear connection was established almost at the end of World War II, not long thereafter. And I now know from 35 years of research that during the 50s, when we were building bombs for bombers, there were sightings at the bases that had nuclear bomber fleets. And then when missiles became the weapon of choice in the early 60s, the focal point for UFO activity, as far as I can determine based on my interviews, seemed to shift to the missile bases in the 1960s. Not exclusively, but certainly that was the trend.
Have to take a short break. We'll be back in just a moment. Don't go away. Steve Steinberg here with a program note. You are watching the television series Dazzle Unlimited. You know, the series airs every Wednesday evening at 8:30 p.m. here on Time Warner Cable of New York City, Southern Manhattan, Channel 79 and 1081. Please make a note of it. By the way, if you have comments for us, or if you'd like to advertise on the Dazzle Unlimited television series, contact us. The email address is dazzle@dazzleunlimited.com. Thanks. And now, please stay tuned because there's more to come on tonight's episode of Dazzle Unlimited. Welcome back. I'm Steve Steinberg. Thank you for rejoining us on tonight's Dazzle Unlimited. And again, my special guest is Robert Hastings, the author of UFOs and NUKES. And we're looking into what he says his information leads him to believe is a definite connection between unidentified flying objects and nuclear power plants, nuclear facilities, and the like. Intriguing area to say the least. So let's get back to my interview with Robert Hastings right now.
There are many cases from Walker Air Force Base in New Mexico, which was near Roswell, our first generation of Atlas nuclear missiles. I've interviewed 7 or 8 missile launch officers who were involved in these incidents. Round objects would hover silently over missile silos.
When you say round, do you mean spherical or?
Disc-shaped, or in some cases spherical, in some cases cigar-shaped, but primarily disc-shaped objects. According to Jerry Nelson, Gene Lamb, one who were the officers who in time of war, if there had been an order from the president, would have turned the keys and launched their missiles. They are now, what I emphasize is the people who are telling me that UFOs are hovering over their missiles are the same people that the U.S. government entrusted with the operation or the guarding of these missiles. They were rigorously vetted. They were given psychological tests. Anyone who works with nuclear weapons, has to be rigorously checked to make sure they're not potentially unstable mentally or have criminal intent, and would create an incident. Well,
wait, why would these people then even talk with you?
The The reasons vary, but the common answer that I get from persons who speak with me is, I have been wanting to tell this for 30 years and I was afraid to, but now that you've approached me, I'm old enough. I think probably the Air Force is not going to, lean on me too hard if I talk to you about it.
Are they still on duty or retired?
Oh no, I never approach active duty missile personnel, Air Force personnel in general. Anyone I talk to have either left the Air Force or retired from the Air Force. Occasionally, of their own volition, I am approached by active duty persons who have heard about my research and want to tell me, and I say, I don't want to be responsible for ruining your career. So, here's my number, here's my address, contact me after you leave the Air Force, then we can talk. So that's been my policy since the early 70s. But I was going to say, there's no way to quantify what has gone on. There's no way to say in 1964 there were this many incidents, in 66 there were this many incidents, in 96 there were this many, because it's catch as catch can. All I can tell anyone who's willing to listen is that since 1948, UFOs have repeatedly flown around the U.S. government's nuclear weapons sites, laboratories, fissile material production facilities, weapons deployment sites, weapons storage areas. There are a handful of declassified documents that were begrudgingly released by the Air Force through the Freedom of Information Act. I have many more cases where I have multiple sources, again, Air Force officers who say this is what happened, this was the base, this was the time frame. And if you file Freedom of Information requests, the Air Force claims to have no documents, which clearly is a deception.
So they'd be violating, in your opinion, they'd be violating the Freedom of Information law when they have documents and say there are no such documents?
Absolutely.
Do you have evidence that that is the case, or is it just a feeling that it may be the case?
I would put it this way. I have 100 people who are willing to testify before Congress. Their service records, speak for themselves. Their positions speak for themselves. For the most part, they do not know each other. Some were in the Air Force in the 60s, some in the 70s, some in the 90s. They were at different bases.
No 80s?
A few in the 80s. Again, it's a random kind of catch as catch can. I do not have any sources from the 1980s, but the story is essentially the same. Saucer-shaped object flies in, is sighted by the security guards at ground level. They call down to the launch control officers. And for the most part, most of the cases that are being described are simply sightings. These objects are maneuvering from missile site to missile site, and then they disappear. Sometimes they're tracked on radar, sometimes they're not.
Are they a pattern?
I have no way of knowing if there's a trend line. All I know is that there's been an on-again, off-again, intermittent pattern of surveillance of our nuclear missile sites and nuclear bomb storage depots at other bases, bomber bases, some of which are addressed in declassified documents, very, very in a cursory fashion, but not a lot of detail. The documents that involve the debriefing of the people who were the witnesses are still secret. But the witnesses are now coming forward. So my point, getting back to your question a couple of minutes ago, is that you have what is circumstantial evidence, anecdotal data. It's not empirical. I don't have the UFO. I can sit on this table and show you the UFO. But you have dozens and dozens of persons who were entrusted by the U.S. government to operate or guard nuclear weapons who are now coming forward and saying that throughout the Cold War era, UFOs repeatedly visited our sites, and on some occasions, I know of probably half a dozen reports, the two at Malmstrom in 1967, one at Ellsworth Air Force Base in 1978, and some other isolated cases where the sources say UFOs were present when an entire group of missiles, what's called a flight of 10 missiles, simultaneously malfunctioned right before the UFO zipped away.
explore new worlds. Read. Visit literacy.gov and let the journey begin.
Steve Steinberg here with a program note. You are watching the television series Dazzle Unlimited. You know, the series airs every Wednesday evening at 8:30 p.m. here on Time Warner Cable of New York City, Southern Manhattan, Channel 79 and 1081. Please make a note of it. By the way, if you have comments for us, or if you'd like to advertise on the Dazzle Unlimited television series, contact us. The email address is dazzle@dazzleunlimited.com. Thanks. And now, please stay tuned because there's more to come on tonight's episode of Dazzle Unlimited. Welcome back to tonight's Dazzle Unlimited. I'm Steve Steinberg. Thanks for rejoining us. Let's get back to my discussion with Robert Hastings, the author of UFOs and NUKES, and see what else this is all about.
Is the primary contractor for the Minuteman system in terms of the signaling of the launch of the missiles and so forth from the launch control facility to the independent missile silos. For example, the one case that's best documented by a researcher named Jim Klotz, who worked with Bob Salas, the launch officer I mentioned earlier. They've established that in the incident in late March of 1967 at Malmstrom, when somewhere between 8 and 10 missiles went down simultaneously, Boeing sent in an investigative team of engineers headed by a man named Robert Kaminsky. And Jim Klotz, this was all done in 1967. Jim Klotz in 1994 or 5 succeeded in locating Mr. Kaminsky and getting him to go on the record. Mr. Kaminsky said some very amazing things. He said that the Boeing team could not replicate the problem. They could find no way based on weather phenomena or short circuiting or any type of electrostatic effect or any electromagnetic radiation, anything that could have caused all 10 missiles to malfunction.
Consider the possibility of sabotage.
Correct.
And investigate it for it.
Now, more importantly than that is Kaminsky has said in a letter to Jim Klotz, which is available now. Mr. Kaminsky said that in the course of their investigation, they got a call from the Air Force saying, "We want you to suspend your investigation." And Mr. Kaminsky told Mr. Klotz that was unprecedented. It hadn't happened before. It never happened again. The Air Force, was the customer, and they were approaching the contractor about a malfunction of a strategic weapon system. In previous cases and subsequent cases, in every case, the Air Force was on their backs to find the problem and to solve it so it would not happen again. So Kaminsky said in this case, to be told that the Air Force wanted them to suspend the investigation before it was completed was unprecedented and made no sense. Therefore, Mr. Kaminsky made his own inquiries. He called his contacts at Malmstrom and was told unofficially that this was considered by the Air Force to be a UFO-created problem, quote unquote. And Kaminsky kept quiet from 67 to the mid-1990s when Mr. Klotz approached him. Now, I alluded to this case at Ellsworth Air Force Base in 1978. This is an extraordinary case. The man who had talked to is retired Air Force Minuteman targeting team member. His name's John Mills. He sent me his service records based on his evaluations of his job performance out of like 9 categories. Quarter after quarter, he scored perfect scores in every category. I've never, seen anybody like that. And these are bona fide, authentic records. And John Mills told me that sometime between Christmas of 1978 and New Year's, he was teamed with he was an enlisted man, a staff sergeant, a tech sergeant, and he was teamed with a temporary officer to do targeting procedures on these missiles because his normal officer was on Christmas leave. And they were down in the underground missile silo doing this alignment procedure for the missiles. So they were down in the hole in the silo doing this with a live missile, doing this procedure. And John Mills said that suddenly their guard was banging on the ladder with this heavy Air Force issued flashlight, and it totally screwed up their alignment procedures because they're very sensitive to vibration. And the guard was screaming down at them, "You've got to get up here now or I'm coming down." And guards can never, they're not legally allowed to be down in the hole. They don't have the authorization. It's a security measure. So John Mills and his temporary officer went up the ladder very mad. They said they were ready to strangle this kid. And they got up at ground level and heard this intense low frequency vibration. He said you could feel it in your teeth. There was a truck next to them. They could feel it reflecting onto them off the truck. He said it wasn't quite mechanical, but they didn't know what it was. And there's a backup generator for the missile launching system in case the electrical power goes offline. It's a triple redundancy system. In any case, they thought maybe the generator had malfunctioned and was creating this vibration. Suddenly, the guards started screaming and said, "Look up!" And long story short, they saw a line in space. On one side was pure black, on the other side was stars. And it was clearly a straight line of an object directly above the missile site. And they actually walked around this thing. The guard was freaking out. John said he and his officer were trying to stay cool, but they were very puzzled about what this was. And they walked around, and he said it appeared to be a diamond-shaped object. They couldn't estimate the altitude, but it was directly above the site. He said, "We're trying to rationally think, is this a barrage balloon? What is this?" And he said after, 5 minutes or something, the hum is apparently getting louder and louder and louder. And at some point, the missile malfunctioned, dropped offline. And they tried to restart it. They were attempting to restart the missile. Meanwhile, this object had moved away. And Mills said they suddenly got a call from the base missile maintenance hangar saying all teams, there were various missile teams out in the field 3, are immediately to report back to the base. And the bottom line was that night he was aware of 3 sites that had gone down based on the testimony of these target teams.
3 sites.
But the people we spoke with several months later said 13 missiles had gone down.
Time's up. Must race. Thanks to my special guest, Robert Hastings, on tonight's Dazzle Unlimited. Thank you for being with us as well. I hope you tune in again next week when I'll be back with another special topic and another special guest on Dazzle Unlimited. See you then. Good night.
Do